My name is Martha Stroud, and I'm the Associate Director of the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research. And it's my pleasure to welcome all of you here and all of you watching on Zoom. The USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research acknowledges our presence on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Tongva people and their neighbors, from north to south, the Chumash, Tataviam, Katanamuk, Sorano, Kawia, Payom-Kawitcham, Ahashiman, Ipai-Tipai, the Kumeyaay, and the Quechan peoples, whose ancestors ruled the region that we now call Southern California for at least 9,000 years. Indigenous stewardship and rightful claims to these lands have never been voluntarily relinquished nor legally extinguished. We pay respects to the members and the elders of these communities, past and present, who remain stewards, caretakers, and advocates of these lands, river systems, and the waters and islands of the Santa Barbara Channel. You can read a more detailed land acknowledgement authored by the USC History Department on their website. And hopefully my colleague Maya is dropping that into the chat for our remote attendees. We'd love to know where everyone is watching from. So if you haven't already, please let us know in the chat. We always like to see how many countries we can get at our events. Last time it was 22. That's a new record for us. So please let us know where you're watching from. And if you want to know what Indigenous territory you're watching from, my colleague Maya will also post a link where you can investigate what Indigenous territory you are on. Feel free to share that in the chat as well. And remember, when you are using the Zoom chat, you can choose from the little drop down for everyone to see your message or just the host and panelists. So speaking of Zoom chat, just a couple of notes about the Zoom protocols. We're going to have time for questions and discussion after the talk, and we invite and encourage the participation and questions of the people in the room, and also those of you watching on Zoom. If you're on Zoom, you can ask your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. You can also ask questions on audio if you choose to by clicking the raise hand button. When considering how to ask your question, please be aware that we're recording this and plan to share it widely, including the discussion questions. So keep that in mind. And for those of you who are asking questions on Zoom, they will be read aloud by my colleague, Maya, who, for the sake of the recording, where the questions aren't visible. Okay. So now to introduce today's talk and give some context for what this wonderful group of scholars is doing at USC, I will introduce Wolf Gruner. Professor Gruner is the Chappell-Guerin Chair in Jewish Studies and Professor of History at USC, and he is the founding director of the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research. Wolf?
Okay. Thank you, Martha. Welcome to everybody here in the room and also on Zoom. The Center for Advanced Genocide Research was founded in 2014 and has organized a lively academic program consisting of annual conferences. The next conference will happen here in October, which is on mass violence and indigenous communities in the Americas and the Pacific region. We have also a speaker series, and we benefit from the research of our fellows program. And this research week is a very unique feature of the center's programming, because normally when we have application for fellowships, people come with well-formulated research programs. This research week is a very different endeavor, because we offer the opportunity to a group of scholars ideally from different countries, different universities, some of them who have never known each other, to come together for 1 week at USC, use the testimonies of the Visual History Archive to develop a research project. So this is practically to support the inception of a new innovative research idea. Previously, we had 2 research weeks over the last years. One was of the well-known geographer collective, which brought together geographers, art historians, and historians working with the metadata of the Visual History Archive. And most recently, the Latin American Research Week, which brought together scholars, interdisciplinary scholars from Latin America, Mexico, Chile, Colombia, Argentina, to work on Jewish immigration during the Holocaust to these different countries. So we are very excited to support a new endeavor. And not only that we brought this group from Europe here, from various countries in Europe, but we have with almost everybody, actually, we have already relationships. Some of them were fellows at the center. Michaela, I know from doing my PhD in Berlin. So, and Elisabeth, we will have more in the future of the relationships because we will host the International Convention of the International Network of Genocide Scholars, which is where Elisabeth is on the board. And so this is especially interesting that for the first time we have so many relationships already. And now I hand over to that the group can introduce themselves, right? Who want to start?
So thank you very much, Wolf, for the kind introduction, and thank you so much, Martha and Wolf, for the wonderful invitation to spend such an intensive working time together here at the center. It was a great pleasure to be able to come together every day, discussing and continuing working on this topic. I would like to welcome you to our brief presentation today on the results of our research week so far, and let's start with a small clip from the VHD.
Do you want to introduce who you will do it? Sorry.
We wanted to start with this voice.
Like, you know, I have a number on my arm. I'm not aware anymore of the number, but I wouldn't take it off because I want the other people should be aware of it. You know, I'm sometimes asked what it is. I say my telephone number. And then I say, you didn't know? No.
The clip you have just seen is the testimony of Lieselotte Ivory from the VHA and refers to our subject of investigation and is one of the sources we've looked at: involuntary body alterations during and after mass violence and genocide. The idea for our project came about in 2018 during my first stay at the center as a visiting scholar. I was working on a knowledge transfer project on the transformation of memorial sites, and during my stay I met Jean-Marc, and we have found that we share some research interests, and finally we had the common idea to put together a group dealing with the topic of body alterations with a focus on tattoos. We applied for this interdisciplinary research week, and yes, now we are here. I would like to briefly show you the course of our presentation. We would like to explain in a few words our guiding question, introduce our team and disciplines, and we move on to briefly describing our own projects and conclude with an outlook on future projects to follow. So I'm happy to pass on to you, Seán.
Thank you. So we started by formulating a guiding question to shape our research this week, which is: how do body alterations influence identification and its representations in and after forced labor camps? So we're looking at not only the stories that survivors themselves have told and are recorded in the Visual History Archive, but also in tellings in literature, in film, in generations after survivors. So we have a diagram which Michaela kindly put together for us with a few keywords around the circumference there. And in the middle is this term involuntary body alteration, which most obviously means tattoos, which were, it's common knowledge that there were tattoos as part of the intake procedures at Auschwitz. But there are other voluntary and involuntary body alterations, which we will talk about. So by that, we mean we are looking at everyday camp environments, however extraordinarily violent those were on a day-to-day basis. And much work has been done, for example, on the ghetto Theresienstadt, but not on body modifications as quotidian physical practices in the forced labor and death camps, especially at Auschwitz, where, as I said, tattooing took place. Examples that we consider include not only tattoos, but clothing and the number that was assigned on the clothing, which is investigated by Michaela to my left. Hair removal, that's myself, and tattoos, also tattoos on the dead body, or looking at tattoos on corpses, and representative tattoos are Anne-Berenike to my right, Dreyfus, Jean-Marc, and Elisabeth. Together we want to work on tattoos in our future research, and we'll return to that subject of future plans at the end of the presentation. Now, we are not considering experiments or other extreme medical interventions on the body, which we know happened in the camps. And generally in the camps, these body modifications were in force. So they were, for the most part, involuntary. And even when we can talk about moments of choice, and we'll unpack that a bit later, those were rare, they were highly circumscribed, and usually circumscribed in a very violent manner. And so the voluntary in our title predominantly refers to later generations who reenact, most notably, the Auschwitz tattoo in memory of survivors who often they're related to. So just to quickly speak to this chart, we have gradated the colors so that at the right here we have materiality, physicality, aesthetics, the kind of outward projection of identity, then more subjective identificatory categories, gender, generation, identity, identification being more something that's situational and towards the outside world. And then we have dehumanization, communication, representation, memory, the kind of interactive, communicative, representational aspects of our study. And we come at this chart from different disciplinary perspectives. So now the long-awaited introduction of us, Anne-Berenike to my right, Michaela to my left, Jean-Marc and Elisabeth. And we represent, the three of us here represent more cultural and literary studies, the more representational side. Jean-Marc is a well-known historian of Holocaust studies, and Elisabeth is a social anthropologist specializing in genocide. So between us, we have an international and interdisciplinary team. And with that, I want to hand over to Michaela to start. We thought, oh, sorry, I'm jumping the gun. Anne-Berenike, take off where I left off. Thank you.
We continue with the individual projects. My idea is to analyze the function of tattoos in literary texts of the first, second, and third generation, and to involve also thematic approaches and performance art. I will deal with the transformation of meaning of the tattoos from the process of deconstructing identity and at the same time an identification, the interlocking of memory and tattoo, and the palimpsestrous, and by this I mean as a cultural concept, the layering of different levels, nature of the tattoos for the first, second, and third generations. In my project, I would like to focus on the female perspective and could imagine that especially in relation to the injured, non-heroized body, new insights can be gained into female historiography and coming to terms with the past. To give a better understanding of what material I work with, I have listed some primary works here. The starting point for me is the testimonies of the VHA of female survivors. You have seen one of these survivors in our short introduction who have been tattooed and tell their stories. Then I have chosen examples from across different media. To give just a few examples from the first generation, Ruth Klüger and Charlotte Delbo are among the most established voices against forgetting and most widely read women writers about their Auschwitz experiences. In both cases, the tattooed number becomes the symbol of an aesthetic strategy, but whereas Ruth Klüger invites dialogue with her number or even forces dialogue, Charlotte Delbo symbolizes her concept of memory through the description of her tattoo. An example from the second generation and the third generation is Emily Prager with her novel Eve's Tattoo. She shows in her fictional story tattooing as an alternative form of memory work, a means of renegotiating tattooing. And Dana Dorin in her documentary Numbered shows tattoos of the different generations to demonstrate how perceptions of Auschwitz tattoos change. To finish my short overview of my ideas and my project, I have listed two projects in the domain of performance. Skin of Memory is a video installation by an artist who is the daughter of two Auschwitz survivors. Visitors see a video installation in the heart of the exhibition space with two images, an Auschwitz survivor with her number tattoo and a young man with modern decorative tattoos. And there was also a table in the exhibition where visitors could choose a motif from a catalog, which was then applied as a temporary tattoo. With people, not numbers, we have a project that is highly interactive and aims at the intensive engagement with the tattooed prisoners. On Holocaust Remembrance Day, postcards were sent by non-profit organizations to a high school and various schools in Israel. The postcard had a water-soluble Auschwitz tattoo on it, and by activating the code, the students and pupils could learn more about the person behind the tattoo. So these contemporary projects try to address especially the younger generation through active remembrance.
Thank you, Anne-Berenike. I'll go on. My working title is First and Second Skin, Prisoner Numbers and Clothing in Concentration and Extermination Camps. Recently, I am working on forced clothing in the camps and prisoner identification numbers. I do this from an anthropological perspective, and I understand clothes as forced body alteration as well. The guiding question, so I'm asking, how can the concept of clothing as second skin establish a multifaceted approach in thinking about clothing, textiles, body, survival in concentration camps? Briefly, I want to explain the present state of the scientific research in regards to clothing and numbers. In the phase of the preparation for this research week, I worked with my colleague Gudrun König on a concept of victims' dresses. It's combined aspects of the clothing business in Third Reich and the garment transports, die Kleidertransporte, departing from Auschwitz. After probing all the relevant archives in Germany, we had to abandon the idea of writing a history of forced and wrapped clothing in concentration camps. The amount of written and printed sources had actively been destroyed by National Socialists at the end of World War II. Existing material was already analyzed in Hermann Kayenburg's Die Wirtschaft des Dritten Reichs, Economy of the Third Reich, under the item textile industry. On the other side, we have Bärbel Schmidt, a fashion researcher and textile specialist who wrote her PhD about the striped uniform of German concentration camps and put an emphasis on the materiality of prisoners' uniforms. They did chemical analysis. Concentration camp dresses, unlike civil ones in the camps, however, both were forced. one of the basic theorems within an anthropology of textiles or fashion studies is that clothing is a second skin. That means clothes modify the body. They are making it act. They prohibit or they allow movement. Seen clothes as an actor, as it was seen from Bruno Latour, for example. The body also modifies clothes in stretching them, in rubbing them up, in wearing them out. The body is leaving marks in the clothing as well. And clothing and clothes have to be seen in an epistemological sense as a source for place, time, textile history, materiality. And clothing is a means of the relation between humans and clothes and the fabric in the camps by forced labor, by forced body, death, survival. Those are the items I'm researching now. In previous research, those aspects I just mentioned weren't taken seriously. Sofia Pantoflaki worked on it using her own interviews with former inmates, but there should be much more, I thought. My focal point is to get a closer look at the emotional and physical daily experiences in a concentration camp. And indeed, I just found stunning examples within the VHA. For example, this of Anna Kremer, you can look at it, a Jewish survivor from Lithuania who preserved her camp clothes from the last concentration camp she was in Stutthof. She explains neatly how she modified her dress for being more comfortable and more secure in the camp. My further look, and this is the connection to the tattoos, my further look applies the forced prisoner number. The applicated numbers of inmates encompass all forms of degradation, force, and loss of individuality. In this case, second skin means one can get itself rid from the number. This is not as easily possible with a tattoo. Later, former inmates often use the number for memory and the source for health and as a source for self-healing and empowerment as well. But at this time, I just can guess what perspectives my further research will offer to us. I'm struggling on. Thank you. And now I overgive to you.
Thank you. So I came to this project through writing a cultural history of the hairdresser or friseur, and it was a paper from that project that I gave on the Lagerfriseur, or the concentration camp barber, which is how I first met Martha in 2017, and now I've got to meet a great team. So emerging out of that project, I was interested in how, well, continue to be interested in how hairdressing, the act of cutting hair, and then more rarely hair care in the camps is portrayed and represented in cultural discourse. But with keeping a focus on the prisoner functionaries, so those who are cutting the hair, then what are the comparisons with those who are doing other prison work in forced labor, such as tattooing, for self-narratives about the concentration camp? And just to sum up now what my findings are before I go into 4 brief points. For obvious reasons, narratives of cutting hair among survivors are much more multifaceted than those of tattooing. For one thing, there's far more of them. Hair was cut and shaved in all camps and at different stages of camp life, as I'll explain in a moment, compared to tattooing. And so the practice was much more varied, as well as there being more of it. By contrast, in representation, by which I mean film and literature, the characterizations of the camp barber are much more stable, are imported into other contexts, such as works about the gulags, and don't have the same intergenerational differences that tattooing does. So beyond the camp, we could say that in later representation, tattooing is less pre-inscribed than narratives about the act of cutting hair. So cutting hair, like tattooing, was an act of control. It was part of a system of camp control and indeed ghetto intake procedures. Very briefly, inmates were cut, shaved. They sometimes had a hair, a line shorn down through the middle of the head in what was known as Entlausung. Most often, the entire head was shaved, as well as armpits and pubic hair, and then very toxic disinfectant was applied to the skin. So it was a very quick, very brutal process. Prisoners then, when they were in the camp, had to go to the Lagerfriseur once a week. But although these visits were obligatory, they had to go in their own time. So when they were not doing forced labor, and so therefore had to queue up in very long lines and go to the camp so-called hair salon. And of course, people were also shaved before the gas chambers, before they were sent to their death. It was a highly violent procedure in which prisoners were recruited and forced to enact this on their fellow inmates. In the words of Dario Gabay, one of the witnesses in the VHA, he describes having to put his foot on a friend's stomach in order to hold them still because he was being watched by the SS guards and had to do so many in a certain period of time, and becoming kind of robotic was the psychological effect of that. And I think Gilbert Metz, who we see here, sums it up very accurately, where he says that's a type of degradation. That's the point of Nazism. You degrade humanity until there's nothing left. Conversely, prisoner functionaries had certain opportunities of self-preservation. For one thing, so prison work for the internal running of the camps, to give an idea, for Auschwitz in February 1944, when there were 12,000 inmates, 30% of them, 12,000 of 41,000 prisoners were given work about the running of the camp itself. And this meant that both men and women cut hair in return for extra rations, work inside. They came into close contact with people higher up in the camp hierarchy, although that close proximity to power could have an extreme cost as well. So we see that there were some opportunities within the camps of an informal economy. They could keep hold of the implements sometimes when they went back to the barracks, and so then they, in return, as part of an exchange system, exchange economy, they would offer shaving services in return for a bit more food or other activities within the camp. So there was an informal economy of sorts and a certain circumscribed place for opportunity. We see here on the slide a shaving brush used by a Polish political prisoner, Józef Paniczewski. That shaving brush was taken, stolen from the suitcases brought in by the transports. And in the other corner, the shaving brush is actually by Alexander Stanigichev, whereas Józef Paczynski, and I apologize for my pronunciation, who was a personal barber to the Auschwitz commandant Rudolf Höss. He was a Jew, and in his words, in another testimony, he says, "I was afraid and he was disgusted." So although he could walk around the camp freely and had advantages, he was also living a life of fear at the same time. Now, we come to the question of self-presentation. Michaela talked about prisoners who tried to alter their clothes. There has been some work done on fashion more broadly, often for the Theresienstadt ghetto, in which this recent claim by Mrazek is an overstatement, but it gets at the point that often it was an internally focused activity to try and restore humanity or human dignity to the experience of being imprisoned. We can contrast that, though, to some testimonies in the archive, for example, by Brigitte Ducek, who gets at the point that often it was called a hairdressing salon, a friseur salon, and then she paraphrases and says, well, basically they were shaving heads. So there was a kind of representational discourse, and then the violent reality of what that actually meant. Within fashion studies and consumerism, there has been some discussion of self-enhancement, again, for dignity, but that is arguably a very, very rare example, and a particularly telling example in the VHA is the testimony of Rosa Berman, who was a Slovak Jew cutting hair, and some ethnic Germans, Reichsdeutsche, came into the camp. They negotiated with the SS that they wanted the 1920s Bubikopf, or kind of short haircuts. The hairdressers then had to quickly learn how to do it under observation, and they did it. And then the SSS guards laughed and mocked them for being incompetent hairdressers, and they were sent outside for forced labor in the cold for 2 weeks. So the agency and the choices that happened were very violently circumscribed and were very barely possible. Just to the final point then from me on representation, the most famous example is Abraham Bomber, who's also in the VHA archive, but from Landsmann's film Shoah. We have literary sources, which I look at. Over the years of different generations, what is most remarkable is, firstly, that the presentation of the camp barber remains very stable as a sort of trope through all the novels here. And secondly, that the same trope finds its way very easily into a Gulag novel about a Ukrainian forced labor camp. And now I pass on to Jean-Marc. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm dealing with the very specific question of the identification of corpses of victims of the Holocaust. So it may sound a bit counterintuitive that there were no corpses left. They have been cremated in the notorious and famous crematoria, like of course in Auschwitz or in Birkenau, or on the pyres of the Operation 1005 for the corpses of Einsatzgruppen victims. But I want to briefly mention that, of course, only a small percentage of the victims' corpses have not been burned, and they were mostly the victims killed in the first weeks or months of the Holocaust. So the first massacres in Poland, for example, in 1941, or more massively, the victims who were killed in the last months of the Holocaust, when Himmler ordered the SS administration to reverse back to mass graves in October 1944, and of course, the victims also of the death marches, and don't forget the many, many victims who died after their liberation, for example, in Bergen-Belsen. So I argue, and I've extensively written already on this, but I'm continuing in this research, that there were massive initiatives to locate, exhume, and possibly identify those corpses. And these initiatives were started by various agents, survivors, families, Jewish communal authorities, national search missions, etc. And that research is continuing till today. Means of identification of those corpses were many. So the traditional forensic identification, you measure the bones, the corpse, but also the object on the corpse. And I'm interested in this research, but it's only, of course, at the very beginning of stories of identification, thanks to the tattoo. That was the only mean of identification, which means, of course, that you could access the file of Auschwitz or the camp to match the number with the names, or someone would remember the number of a comrade that died. I say, oh, this is my comrade. I remember the number. It means also to take into account the physiology, the very rapidly decaying corpse. So the number on a dead body will be visible for only a very short period of time, and especially if the body has been buried and will be exhumed. I'm very interested in exhumation, post-Holocaust exhumations. It's very symbolic, those stories I have found, collected. I would say the process of dehumanization was from names to number, and it's visible, readable in so many accounts, and we have seen that. It's bringing the numbers to names again. which is the title of a book. You will see the reference. VHA archives, I'll be very quick. I found so far no example, zero in the VHA archives, but I'm sure there are many. It's just like the indexing process doesn't, I played a lot with the indexing, with the index and didn't find anything, but maybe I will find something in these extraordinary archival material. I have, in fact, two stories. I will mention very briefly only one, which is story in my hometown. Can we go back just to the previous? So this is the gas chamber of the Struthof Natzweiler camp, concentration camp in annexed Alsace, so the only one built on formerly French territory. It's in the Vosges. It was used only once to kill 86 victims, Jews and Sinti and Romas, including 30 women, sent from Auschwitz to the Struthof. It was an order, I would say, by the infamous August Hirt, who was a Nazi professor, German, at the Reich University Strasbourg, who wanted to build up his own collection of skeleton. You know, the colonial practices of we started in Nazi Germany for science. So they were gassed and sent by night to the medical school of Strasbourg, the very center of Strasbourg, the same place, still where medical students learned their first anatomy classes, and they were cut. So can I have the next one? Sorry for the dreadful picture. They were cut into pieces. Here didn't really know what he wanted to do. He didn't know how to deal. We have the testimony of Mr. Henri Pierre, who was a Alsatian with a complex story, but he was the lab assistant of Hirt. And in the many testimonies he gave, he said first, Hirt wanted the tattoo to be removed. Which reason? We don't know, probably for its own collection. He wanted to collect the tattoos. And second, Henri Pierre took the numbers. And this is the list. I don't think it's the original list. It's the list that was retyped for the criminal procedures that was started by the French. If you count, I counted last night, you have 87 numbers, not 86. It's one of the many mystery that needs to be further researched in this story. And you have the numbers and no name, but one, Menachem Tafel, a Jew born in Berlin in 1900. Only in 2004 had a German, so not a friend, a German journalist and social anthropologist, but he's a kind of an outsider. He was a journalist and he had some teaching classes to be given in a German universities. And I'm so interested that it's an outsider of both academia and memorial culture, who had the idea to take those names and to send them to the Auschwitz archives, and then they could identify the names. And he wrote a book. You will see it in the reference list. Very important because he could write the story. So from numbers to names, but from names to the story of those people you had people deported from Norway and you had people deported from Greece. The variety of the Holocaust. Okay, and also this story has been a ghost in Strasbourg and Alsace since 1945, and has been not tackled properly. In the medical students, have this story in their mind and above them, when they start working. And it's only a few months ago did the University of Strasbourg publish an official report, very significant report on this story, and it at last, I would say, after so many years. Thank you. So I pass it to Elisabeth.
And
I will try to stay short, to leave some time to discussion. Actually, I'm the outsider. I'm not working on the Holocaust. As my expertise lies on the Soviet Gulag and especially more especially its material legacy. And the starting point of my research project was the work of this prison guard who all his life long collected, drawn actually the tattoos that he had been seeing among the convicts in the Gulag and in the prison, because he had a very long career. And actually what is interesting is that his work enabled us to understand that these tattoos were coded, and that these tattoos were enabling the other inmate to understand who they had in front of them and what had been their life in prison and outside prison, with some tattoo, for example, this one saying, I'm an orphan. And this tattoo saying that I was an orphan raised in an orphanage. And some of the tattoos saying, well, I've been in prison 5 times. So basically these tattoos being a language and a code, enabling, and he is also showing that some of the tattoos were forcibly done. So we have this idea that all the tattoos were chosen, but some of them we knew, thanks his work, were forcibly done. So that was my starting point. And second slide. Actually, I would like to enlighten this first corpora of documentation with the information that we have in the testimonies of these men. So I've chosen to focus on the testimonies that were collected in Russia and in Ukraine just after the fall of Soviet Union. So, and I've chosen to focus on the men who were more likely to have been in prison before or after they had been returning from the Nazi camp, because when they were returning to USSR, they were obliged to go through filtration camp, sometimes in the very camp where they had been detained by the Nazi. So they were going back to the same place, going through the same procedure, and having to explain what kind of tattoos they were bearing. And I would like to, I have so far seen that there are 1,692 testimonies of these men. Among these 1,000, I need some help. There are 24 of them that are explicitly mentioning the fact that they have been through filtration and detention camps, and 12 of them showing their tattoos. So the first thing is I would like to see these tattoos and to understand what do they represent. I know that there are some figures, some letters, some graphic sign, and I would love to have a proper record of it. And then I would like to hear what they are saying about these signs and the way these signs have been understood when they came back in the Soviet Union, and the way the role these tattoos have played in their own identification, in the self-identification process, but also in the way they have been perceived by the society they were returning to. So a lot of things remains to be done. I would like to draw upon this idea of colonial corporeality, these bodies having been, whether in the Nazi camp or in the Soviet labor camp, having been through a huge system of domination relationship. And I would like to understand the role these body marking are playing in this system of domination. But I'm only starting, so it's, I hope there will be a future to this research program. I really do.
And that's a nice point at which to move on to next steps. So as a group, we have pursued our individual projects informed by our own research, and these have been deepened by the VHA, by the Visual History Archive already. And so we're going to publish that work individually and share drafts with each other and so on and so forth as a result of this week as the quick wins. But midterm, we do think that it's more than the sum of its parts, and that we intend to put forward a grant application that quite frankly means that we can come back and do more of the same. So thank you very much for the week we have had. And Anne-Berenike was the person who brought us all together originally, and so to bring us back with the aim of a collective monograph rather than an edited volume on tattoos and internment during and after genocide specifically, in a format that makes the most of this visual material, both moving images and stills. And we wanted to end with a still. So on the left there we have Gilbert Metz, who was in my slide, worked among other things in cutting hair, but was tattooed as an inmate of Auschwitz. And his grandson, Joseph Metz, has had his grandfather's number tattooed onto his wrist in commemoration of his late grandfather. And as we heard from Anne-Berenike's presentation, that is something that is both relatively common among the third generation now, and has found its way into artistic representation, where you concluded with an example from performance art. With that, we thank you very much for your time and for your questions to come, and thank you, Wolf and Martha, for hosting us.
Okay, so now time for discussion, both in the room and on Zoom. Please ask your questions, and you all can call on whoever you like, and Maya will raise their hand to ask questions from Zoom.
I think you can ask.
Great, we have
Now, they are
moderators.
deciding who is going to say yes. Okay.
We all say yes.
Thank you very much for this presentation. I want to use the opportunity to kind of get a little bit more out of you, what is the kind of thing which goes beyond the individual project. So how do you envision what synergy will come out of the cooperation? Maybe you have some ideas developed during this week, and maybe some ideas where this can go. And an additional question I had is, you talked about briefly about permanent and temporary body alterations. I'm wondering if we think about this today, even tattoo, or do we think it is permanent? It's actually temporary because you can remove it or you can re-tattoo it. And so how does this play into your kind of elaborations and discussions?
Okay,
I mean, on the second question, I think what is so interesting is that for most of the witness testimonies, the tattoo is something that is very permanent, that they speak about not removing it, and that it was obviously forcibly inscribed, and they went from a name to a number, as we've discussed. And actually then within representation and in performance art and works, it is precisely not so pre-inscribed and momentary and fused and reworked into different situations, and performance art that goes wrong when Israeli artists realized that it wasn't a number of a Jewish survivor that he had tattooed onto his arm, but one of a perpetrator, and so on and so forth. That these there is much more play, if you can call it that, with the tattoo than with other ephemeral forms of bodily modification that were in the camps had far more multifaceted ways of contributing to subjectivity, as you heard about clothing or hair. Do you have something to say on the wider?
I think the big difference is that with the third generation, they want to be the tattoo under construction as a call for dialogue, as an interactive form, as a performance itself. It's temporary, yeah. And the former tattoos were meant to be, for eternity, or if they get rid of the tattoos like Ruth Klüger, it was really a statement to say, now I'm perhaps over it, or I don't want to talk about my bad experience with the help of the tattoo. So this lively interaction, I think, is with the third generation more prominent.
And I think the issue of erasure in itself is a topic that we have to work on all together. Because on some of the signs, it's one of the quotation of one of the testimonies I've been through. The man is saying, oh, the last figure can't be seen anymore. It has vanished with time. So you have this issue also of tattoo being badly done and erasing with time. And well, forcible or not forcible erasure could be also an issue that we would work on. And as about your first question, what we have learned is that we understand much more better our own topic when we are given the opportunity of speaking together, really brainstorming. And we will need to find a way to keep on this bubbling process going on in order to be able to get the best from our work. And of course we have Zoom, but you can't really brainstorm by Zoom. So we will have to find a way to meet, maybe at some conferences, or to invite each other. But definitely we understood, being there, all the five of us during a week, that it's much more than being 1 + 1 + 1 + 1.
I'm sorry. Cool.
Yeah, I mean, you asked the right question and we don't have an answer, but what do we have in common, and what is a main question, a light flag that may emerge? So I think we deal with the question of with body studies, crossing Holocaust and genocide studies in general. We're not the first one, and it has been done, but it has never been done systematically. And to have another question, which is really the common feature of all the presentation, is about the forced identification on the body, the mark being forced, whether the haircut, the tattoo, the way this forced identification on the body has been received, but also a way of resisting it, reusing it, re-employing when they were margin for maneuver, very limited in the time of prosecution, wider, very wide for the survivors, So that may be something we may pursue as a main question.
But I think just a really simple answer, which is why we started with the testimony, is the material, or the kind of the inked tattoo. We've all started from the same material, and that's a really simplistic answer. But starting from that common point, you see how it's received and changed through the different generations in these different contexts. But actually, it's a material topic, but we've been quite material driven this week. And coming from, my past is all in sort of textual analysis and stuff. I feel quite secure with material approaches. But I think that we talked a lot about how do we open this, and you asked whether we present ourselves, and we thought, well, if we start with these stories that are so strikingly familiar across generational lines, that we can kind of go out from that.
And I think it was really good that Anne-Berenike, when she contacted us, we just had a term we were using. It was the term of the palimpsest. And also this term we really had widely discussed in these days, if we could use it for a connecting term in the works we are doing with. Because I have to work with clothing. And so I thought the idea of a second skin, as in anthropology of textiles is used, would be also a good connection to the other ones. The second skin even is a skin, and it also, if you look on the clothing of the example I gave, she also shows her number. The number is in several times it's overlaid, like in a palimpsest. I think perhaps this would be a figure we can think further.
I think that's you are first.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for this talk. It's been very interesting and given me a lot of ideas to think about. So I just have two quick questions. So for one, thinking about this thing that we've been talking about of the third generation and the performative act of getting the tattoos, did any of you come across the first generation's reaction to these tattoos, or just tattoos in general of the second and third generations and how they feel about these? And then I also wondered if you considered in body alterations menstruation and the loss of menstruation, and that being considered as an involuntary alteration due to the lack of food and sustenance. Thank you.
Could we take the other question and then wrap up the answer to be sure to have time?
No.
No?
We have
Yeah, we have time? Okay.
I can start by answering the first question. I have the impression that the reactions from the first generation, if there are survivors who can react, are very positive. If you look at the documentary by Dana Doran, which is a film about generation, about the transgenerational aspect of the tattoo, how the tattoo was meant for, or what the tattoo, the function of the tattoo for the Auschwitz survivors, very differently received. Some show it very proudly. Some say, I can't remember it. Some say, I can only spell it in German. It's such a traumatic, I don't want to spell it in my mother tongue. I can't do it. Very differently seen. But the adaptation from the third generation of the tattoos from their grandparents, I think all these elderly people are so proud that there are living memorandums for their past. I have the impression that if it is in a way that is respectful, I think that it is appreciated.
I can have a go at the second question, sorry, which is, so I haven't come across anything about menstruation specifically, but obviously camp barbers, tattooists also were often shifted between various forms of body work. And so they talk about things like cleaning toilets and so on and so forth. And so it's very clear that people talked about their own experiences and what they had to do with others, with digestion, going to the toilet, having to invade other people's bodies to check to see if people were hiding things, and that this had obviously very, very deep effects on people. So there is a whole wide range of body alterations to do with the kind of natural cycle of the body that was interfered with. And I suppose we restricted ourselves to those which involved crudely, pieces of equipment to kind of adorn the body, as it were. But it would not surprise me in the slightest if there weren't a number of testimonies about menstruation, but you could go through and look. I'm not sure what the index terms would be, but these kind of body workers, for want of a better term, bring those topics up.
Thank you. So I have some questions from the chat. The first one, I'll go by order of when they were submitted. So we have a question from Fatma. Greetings, thank you for a great presentation. I wondered if the tattooing and such during the Holocaust was also extended to other violated groups like gays or the Roma or the disabled. Also, is the response to tattoos gendered in any way?
Okay, I just can answer that. In fact, the common knowledge, and Wolf may contradict me, is that tattoos were made only in Auschwitz. And that there were no tattoo made in other concentration/death camps. So that's basic fact. Then, going in more detail in the testimonies, we see that there were many exceptions, that some tattoos were made, but not in a systematic way in other camps. But strangely enough, we don't know. We don't have a coherent, complete research done that may answer the question.
But always in the framework of dehumanization.
Yes,
it's always an element in this process of dehumanization, even if the tattoo wasn't made in Auschwitz.
Because what was the origin of this tattooing of bodies? It was tattooing the cattle or marking the cattle in the Wild West.
And I think it's important as well that the tattooing in Auschwitz was for those who had to remain in Auschwitz. The numbers were not for those who went primarily to the gas chambers, for those who had to work in Auschwitz in the other camps around Auschwitz.
In the Visual History Archive, there's a clip, and the question about the tattoos is very similar. What have you felt by getting a tattoo? And the woman answers, it was a relief. It was a relief because I knew that I meant to survive or to live.
That's what one of the Russian detainees is saying. He is asked, what does that mean for you, this tattoo? And he is answering, that means that at that moment, that meant that I was alive so far.
Yeah.
Can I add something that the other part of the question doesn't get lost? So not only Jews were marked, but also Romani, Sinti and Roma. They had their special kind of Z as the beginning often.
Resistance fighter, Charlotte Delbo was not Jewish. She was deported in the single. She was as a resistance fighter. Yep. So it was, we don't know why this convoy of female resistance fighters from France was sent to Auschwitz. They didn't stay long because there was a mistake. Then they were sent to Ravensbrück.
Just on the gendered point, if you look through the archive for those who did the tattooing, they were both men and women. Although it does, the comment about the degradation with haircutting from Gilbert Metz was also referring to the fact that even if there were women barbers or tattooists available, because people were naked, they would often get men to do it on the women to be even more degrading. But there were both men and women who worked in that way.
And I see that's something I alluded to. You had a anthropological shift regarding the tattoos somewhere in the 1960s. That tattoos till 1945, and it was for marginalized people, was for prisoners, was for criminals, was for sailors, or for prostitutes. A lot of tattoo with prostitutes. We have 19th century sketches of books made with copying tattoo. If you read Alain Corbin on the prostitution in France, you have a whole chapter on tattoos. And of course, now today, it's absolutely different. It's self-affirmation, it's a self-statement, it's a matter of freedom, etc., etc. So this is something we are also to keep in mind. For those people, the tattoo could never be a sign of self-esteem. So
at the back.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So if I'm understanding what you're saying correctly, there was a sort of disparity. So there were the case where people, inmates would modify their clothing or do something with their hair as a means of like preserving self-identity. That was rare. Like it was something that should be considered the norm. But this is anecdotal, but most of the narrative instances I've read about someone going through the Holocaust, they almost all involve something along those lines, like claim that they're trying to do something that mentally convinces themselves they're trying to hold on to their humanity. Do you think that there's any sort of like attempts to include that to make a more dramatic story when in reality that didn't happen, thus creating a disparity between how it actually was and how it's portrayed? If that makes sense.
I mean, so it is part of a narrative, right? And there can be all kinds of reasons for a narrative, absolutely. I think, some of the research that has been done, so it's very little, but the two examples that I gave and are in the reading list at the end, or the bibliography, overstate the case maybe in assuming that the self-understanding is reflective of what the practice was, but the self-understanding was important for that, as you say, that regaining of humanity. So it's not necessarily done to dramatize or overstate the case, but that it is part of a feeling of, when you have nothing, trying to make yourself feel more whole and more human in the moment. But the important point that I meant with the example of the hairdresser got the Bubikopf wrong was that there were, of course, hierarchies among prisoners and very different groups among prisoners. So it was very dependent on where you sat in the hierarchy, how long you'd been in the prison, what in the camp, what kind of ethnicity you had, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there isn't a simple answer, but I wouldn't say it's always a conscious dramatization, but more also for a self-dignity.
So I have two questions from folks in the chat, as well as just wanted to know before I ask the question, there's been some discussion in the chat, which I'm sharing right now, that some just folks wanted to share that not all survivors approved of subsequent generations getting tattoos. So I just wanted to bring that up from the chat and thank the viewers for their comments. But the next question is from Darren, who was bringing up Diane mentioning that her father called the camp clothing pajamas. And of course, they do look like pajamas. Does anyone know if there's evidence that the camp clothing was designed to intentionally infantilize and degrade the prisoners? Or was it designed that way for other reasons?
It's a design that was usually used for prisoner clothes as well, and also before. It was not especially designed for the concentration camps, but those uniforms we know from concentration camps were produced for the concentration camps. And I think it's really important to know that those striped clothes just were worn in the first years of the concentration camps. Afterwards, after 1942, there wasn't enough fabric for doing them. So most of the inmates had civil clothes that were marked with the signs of the concentration camps, the numbers, the triangles, and so on. That's really important that we have many inmates that didn't have those striped clothes. And even afterwards, the striped clothes were so important that, for example, we find in the USHMM in Washington, we find in the archives many clothes that are they are fake. They were redone and declaimed as originally worn clothes from the camps, but they weren't. This my colleague recognized when she did those analyses of the fabrics.
And then we do have Peg Levine has been raising a hand. I'm not sure how it'll work on the Zoom.
We're gonna allow her to speak and we'll see if we can hear her.
So
Peg, we just sent you a request to unmute yourself.
I did. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm here in Melbourne, Australia right now.
Wow.
Yes, I love my mornings. So I'm at the University of Melbourne, and I've been associated with the Center for Advanced Genocide Research there in LA. And I just really want to thank you for your overlapping research. It's really stimulated me this morning. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to kind of introduce a wider genocide perspective on your research that taps into my new research. So I'll try to be brief. I did a 10-year ethnographic study in Cambodia with victim survivors of the Khmer Rouge. And during that time, incidental to my film ethnography, I started recording tattoos, protective tattoos. So my work falls outside of a monotheist perspective. And yet I'm interested in sort of the mystical in Jewish studies as well, where there's some overlap in the animist and polytheist orientation that people have in Cambodia. And then I was in LA, and incidental to my interest, I visited the temples in Long Beach, only to discover monks there that had tattoos on their heads, elder monks, because the art of tattooing for protective purposes is being lost. So that part of that relates to my term ritual side that I brought into the literature. So my question is, having given you that background, I've been digesting your categories that you, on your wheel that you put up at the very beginning. And in terms of overlap, especially coming from an polytheist animist perspective, there were two things. One, people secretly sought, at the risk of being killed under the Khmer Rouge, tattoos for protection, for spirit protection. And the location of those tattoos was quite specific. If they were on the head, then it would have a stronger impact on the spirits that were roaming around them that could protect them. It also had an effect on deceased ancestors that were roaming as a way of almost protecting their spirits that had died a violent death. So that's one area I wanted to introduce, was just this other category of protection that we might be able to add if we go further out in genocide studies. And so the other thing I was thinking about the dehumanization, and there's this forced stench that I noticed that happens, whether it's people being, just forced to have just chemicals put on their bodies and they have to smell that. Under the Khmer Rouge, it was sort of the opposite. People actually couldn't bathe. And what the olfactory assault, if you will, or the sensory assault, was really about being overwhelmed by their own body smells. So I just sort of wanted to just add sort of an overlapping, but coming in from the other side. So my question is, in your research, have you found anything that relates to body alteration that has to do with a particular kind of spirit? I use that word in the animist sense, or spiritual. I can use that in the monotheist sense, where people had body alterations around a particular kind of protection or access to other, maybe from a mystical perspective?
I do. I have in my Soviet labor camp, actually, some of the inmates had tattooing Lenin either on the belly or in the back, in order not to be shot. Because they think that if they were about to be executed, then they would take the shirt off and the soldier couldn't shot at the image of Lenin. So the tattoo was supposed to protect themselves from death in this logic of having to potentially to be executed.
And one other question. Thank you so much. That's fascinating. I'll get in touch with you. But the other question relates to, because I've been going through some of the archives at the Shoah Foundation around sort of mysticism, if you will. I'm using that word very loosely, in the Yiddish transcripts. And I'm just wondering, do you see any relationship to the research you're doing and sort of the, I don't know, the juxtaposition of language? I just find it fascinating that people's serendipitous stories of having survived in the Yiddish transcripts seem to be more steeped in mysticism. And I just wonder if you found anything related. And then I'll flip the platform over.
It's not something we have researched. We don't have the knowledge. Just to add that in the Orthodox Judaism, traditionally tattoos are banned. Any body alteration that you would made is not permitted. It's very strongly something very strong. So also linked to this. That is for the Jewish victims of the Holocaust arriving to the camp. It was a supplementary layer of dehumanization and breaking away from the tradition.
So there's other tattoos, sorry, that were just mentioned. That would almost be like the Lenin tattoo. That would be a statement of revolution. It would be a revolutionary sort of statement in a way.
Sorry, which was the?
You mean, no, I don't think it was a political statement at all.
No.
It was very pragmatical.
Okay, so it wasn't revolutionary, a little different than political.
I think it was clearly a way to play with the game of the references of the others.
Okay.
And having their references on you in order to put a kind of shelter, of protection. But it wasn't a political statement at all. In all the tattoos that are related to political figures, they bear criticism, like Stalin bearing horns, or some of the political figures portraying as a devil. So you can see in those tattoos a part of political critique, but wearing the tattoo of Lenin, especially on the back or on the belly, in order not to be shot, is a way to play. They don't believe that they wouldn't. It was a way to play with the code of the perpetrators.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much for that. Mm.
And this actually, I think, pairs well with Peg's previous conversation of like what the VHA has in the archives. This comes from Becky. Thank you for your presentation, really interesting. Do you have plans or a desire to extend your research to further case studies of genocide? The VHA has a couple of interviews with Armenian survivors who were tattooed. And I'm thinking of Zoe Norridge's work on Rwandan survivors who have very visible scars.
Armenia was planned. I mean, but for practical reason, our colleague had to renounce coming to LA with us, but it was planned to include the dimension of the Armenian genocide for sure. For the Rwanda, I mean, it's not a matter, yeah, the body modification, the wounds are, it's something we have dealt with, not for the moment, you know, the wounds of survivors. But it's something we should maybe think
Scars
about.
and wounds, yeah, we will have to reflect on that.
So before we go back, there's a lot of questions on Zoom, a lot of activity. I just want to open it back up to the people in the room to ask their questions. We're just going to go for about 5 more minutes because of the technical problem that delayed the start. But does anyone in the room have a question?
Sorry, I have a question. So you talked a lot about material things, materiality. So my question is, when we think about, for example, tattoo as body modification, do you take tattoos as an artifact? Because there's a lot of studies now about artifacts in the Holocaust. Or is it more like a hybrid where you have material aspect or material side, but also an immaterial side?
I think also going back to Peg's point about the stench, you know, what's quite interesting is when you look at descriptions of or memories of the act of tattooing, just like the act of cutting hair or whatever, the disinfectant was taken from the gas chambers. There was these times these were very strong and recognizable smells. But the whole set of memories and that kind of it's a very situated memory, and so yeah, it's not just the artifact, but the kind of and it's not just immaterial, but there's the kind of very strong set of collocations that go along with it.
And the semiological function, and that's why it works quite well with our projects. If you approach with with the expression semiological.
And I think skin is an artifact. Actually, we are skin, whether the first one or the second one, skin is our artifact, and the way this artifact is altered from the outside, and the way this alteration of this specific. In medicine, you have this understanding of tegumentary system, being the part of the body that is the layer between the inner body and the outside world. And this tegumentary system incorporates the skin, the hair, the nail, and it's an artifact from a biological point of view. So we are dealing with this materiality of the skin, of the hair, and the way this materiality has been altered.
But I think that speaking as a hybrid is a good idea. I would underline this aspect really.
And we didn't mention, but we in our conversation it came up, which is something both a reality and a myth, which is the collections of skin, of tattoos on the skin, you know, which is a very blurred story. You know, we know that there were some kind of exhibition made by the immediate survivors of Buchenwald, no? It's, if I'm correct, and we don't know where those artifacts are. You have a lot of legends, you know, the lampshade, the tattoo being removed, you know, and kept by the SS doctors. And it's all over the I would say the pulp literature of camps from the late 1940s. And also another among so many, another topic that could be there to us.
I have some final questions in the chat. First again from Fatma, how would you distinguish scarring from tattooing? And then I'm going to read out the other question from Oren, just because I think it's already been covered a little bit, but maybe you have something to add. Saying, I appreciate the mention of the novel Eve's tattoo as a precursor to the performative appropriation of Holocaust tattoos, which raises the issue of the varied ways adopted tattoos as opposed to involuntary ones can be used. And could you say more about the latter? And also asking about the implications of Jewish halakhic prescriptions against tattooing. So again, Fatma's question was, how do you distinguish scarring from tattooing? And Oren's is asking about more about like Jewish halakhic prescriptions against tattooing. And the first question is a little multi-layered.
Shall I answer about the scars? Actually, we consider the scars as a way for the body to recover from a wound. And this wound is not necessarily intentional. It may be an accident or surgery. So the field would be too broad, and we would have to say that we are only working on the scars that are the leftovers of an intentionally inflicted harm. So, but how can you say that this scar is okay because it was inflicted and this one is not, just because you broke your arm and fell from a ladder and had surgery? So I think that would oblige us to go too deep in this kind of differentiation. And I think that tattooing, in the fact that it is forcibly inflicted and with the intention of lefting a mark that has a meaning, an explicit meaning, with a numbering someone in a list, having this person belonging to a group. This is to us what we would like to work on.
And indeed, that meaning in the moment is a very crass, straightforward, immediately recognizable one. It becomes a uniform. It's not a ambiguous or kind of secret code or anything. But then in the retellings, to pick up on Eve's tattoo, and that's what Anne-Berenike is working on, they become made much more ambivalent and ambiguous, precisely because of the ethics of who has a right, if anyone, to tattoo themselves there. And which number, and yeah, do you want to say?
No.
Maybe one suggestion or consideration is when Elisabeth just talked about leaving a mark, is tattooing not actually a euphemistic term, because it's actually about marking and not about what kind of the public and most people think about what is tattooing, right?
Yeah.
So maybe one should also reconsider what terms we are using for.
Other term is changing in the diet.
Just to finish up on the religious prescription against tattoo, you know, in Orthodox Judaism, your body doesn't belong to you. It's sacred because man is made from the image of God, and which you have to link to the ban on cremation. You don't cremate, but also it goes very far that in some Orthodox Jews, and it's also something I know from my family history, when you cut your hair or you cut your nail, you will not throw them away. You will bury them, which is, very extreme in some traditions, because it's something sacred that has to go back to the earth where it comes from, because we have been created according to the Genesis, to the Bible, from the earth, which is just the Spirit of God. So it's very strong. It's more a tradition, a philosophy, Jewish philosophy, than a real prescription in the Halacha.
All right, well, thank you to the 5 of you. Thank you to everybody who attended in person and online. We have another event on Thursday, October 6th, a lecture by Charlotte Kichel about the role of Holocaust memory in Rwanda's national culture when it comes to Rwandan genocide. So we hope that you'll join us in person and online for that one. And thank you again.
Thank you for your interest.